10 minutes. That's how long it took an AI-powered framework called HexStrike to compromise thousands of Citrix network devices using a single known vulnerability. Not hours, not days, 10 minutes. And the exploit ran autonomously. It was an intelligence system connected to over 150 cybersecurity tools, scanning, identifying weak points, and executing attacks while a human operator did nothing but set the parameters and step back. That number comes from a report that Booz Allen Hamilton published today, and it sits next to two other stories that have nothing to do with cybersecurity and everything to do with the same structural problem. In Southern California, an AI advocacy platform generated over 20,000 public comments that may have swayed regulators to reject clean air rules estimated to save 2,500 lives. In Hollywood, ByteDance pulled a video generation model off its global launch schedule after it produced footage of Tom Cruise fighting Brad Pitt from a 2-line text prompt. 3 domains, 3 collisions, and in each one the same thing's happening. A generative system is producing output at a speed and scale that the receiving institution was never really architected to absorb. Let me stay with the cybersecurity story first, because what Booz Allen documented isn't just another warning about hacking, but a description of a structural phase change in how digital conflict actually works. They identified 2 models of adversarial AI use that are already deployed and in the wild. In the first, intelligence systems act as amplifiers for human attackers, accelerating reconnaissance, scanning dozens of targets simultaneously, automating that tedious work of finding an opening. Now, in the second model, the human defines the mission parameters and leaves. The AI system connects to offensive security frameworks and executes autonomously. HexStrike is that second model, made real. It's an open source red teaming tool. It was originally built for legitimate security testing, and it connects large language models to more than 150 cybersecurity tools. So it acts as this orchestration brain. You give it a target and a vulnerability, and it figures out how to exploit that chain on its own. Within hours of new Citrix vulnerabilities being disclosed, HexStrike has developed a way around them against thousands of devices. Now, CISA, the Federal Cybersecurity Agency, recommends a 15-day remediation window for critical vulnerabilities. 15 days. This attacker only needed 10 minutes. So that's not a gap you really close by just working harder. It's a gap that exists because the defensive architecture was designed for a world where attackers were also just human paste. And this connects directly to something we covered back on March 7th. The Mozilla Anthropic partnership had Claude scan Firefox's codebase, you'll remember, and found 22 genuine vulnerabilities in just 14 days. The Anthropic researchers said explicitly that the gap between AI's ability to discover vulnerabilities and its ability to exploit them was unlikely to last very long, and here we are 9 days later. The Booz Allen report tells us that that gap has already collapsed for certain attack vectors. So discovery and exploitation are now happening in the same automated pipeline. So here's what I want to push past, where most cybersecurity coverage stops. The typical framing is, this is terrifying. Defenders need to move faster. We are losing the race. And the first 2 points, yes, they are true. But the trajectory runs through the alarm and to something else. Brad Mederi, who leads the Booz Allen's cybersecurity practice, said the quiet part out loud. Defenders will be forced to delegate real-time response to AI systems, not because they want to, but because when the attacker moves at machine speed, a human-in-the-loop defense isn't slow, it's basically absent. So by the time a human analyst reviews the alert, triages the incident, and decides on a response, the attacker has already moved laterally through the network. So what emerges on the other side of that forced delegation is a security domain where both offense and defense are AI-mediated. So humans can set parameters, humans review outcomes, humans design the architecture, but the real-time engagement, that moment-to-moment defense of the network, becomes a conversation between machines because it has to. And that's not just a temporary arrangement while we figure out something better. No, this is the new permanent condition of digital security. The organizations building that architecture right now, the ones treating AI-mediated defense as infrastructure rather than experiment, they will define what security means for the next era. All right, another story here. Let's look at different domain, same structural collision. The South Coast Air Quality Management District, the regulatory body for Southern California's air basin, has proposed rules last year that would have phased down gas-fired heaters in favor of heat pumps. Now, their own estimates The rules would have saved $25 billion in health costs and roughly 2,500 lives. Most agenda items that this agency reviews receive some public comments, in the single digits or so. But this one, they received over 20,000 opposing comments, and the board voted 7-5 against the rules back in January 2025. So here's what happened in between. A public affairs consultant with ties to the gas industry contracted with a company called CivicLick. CivicLick describes itself as the first and best AI-powered grassroots advocacy platform. What it does, concretely, is it takes a political position and it uses AI to generate personalized advocacy messages, each one different enough from the others that they don't look like form letters, each one written as though a real person sat down and expressed a genuine view. The consultant stated publicly that CivicLick made the ultimate difference in this outcome. So let's sit with that for a little bit. Public comment periods are not decorative. They are a foundational mechanism of American regulatory governance. The legal architecture assumes that when an agency receives a public comment, it represents a real person with a genuine stake in that outcome. Agencies are required to consider those comments. They weigh the volume and the substance of public input when they make decisions. The entire system rests on a basic premise that the comments are from a real person. CivicLick doesn't forge signatures. It doesn't hack the submission portal. It does something more elegant and more corrosive. It manufactures voice at scale. Each comment is technically real in the sense that it exists, but the opinion it expresses was generated by an AI system operating on behalf of a paying client with an opinion. The agency had no framework for distinguishing these from authentic public input, and it still doesn't. Environmental and public health advocates are now asking the California Attorney General and the LA District Attorney to investigate whether fraud actually occurred, if this even counts as fraud. So no formal investigation has been launched yet, and the rules have been set back to the committee with no timeline. So they're going to have to vote on these rules again. So here's where this collides with the cybersecurity story at the structural level. In both cases, a generative system is producing the output faster than the receiving institution can verify it, right? The cybersecurity asymmetry is measured in 10 minutes versus days, and the democratic participation asymmetry is measured in volume, 20,000 comments arriving in a process designed for just dozens. So the mechanism is completely different. And the architecture of the problem, though, is identical. Generative capability outrunning institutional capacity to distinguish from noise. Every regulatory body that accepts public comment faces this vulnerability now. Every city council, every state agency, every federal rulemaking process. The cost of generating a comment has collapsed to near zero. The cost of verifying one hasn't changed. And this is not a temporary imbalance. That's a permanent feature of the generative era, unless authentication infrastructure gets built into the participation mechanisms themselves, not as afterthought, but as plumbing. So the 61 regulators who issued that coordinated statement on AI-generated imagery back in February framed non-consensual synthetic content as a fundamental rights violation. The CivicLick episode suggests we need the same type of framework extended to synthetic democratic participation, because what was manufactured in Southern California wasn't just comments. It was the appearance of public will, and that appearance may have now cost 2,500 lives if this continues to go unchecked. So that's something serious that we need to look into. Now let's look at a different collision point. Same generative pressure though. ByteDance built a video generation model called Seedance 2.0, announced back in February and launched in China, and within days people were generating footage of Tom Cruise fighting Brad Pitt. You might remember this. From a 2-line text prompt. The performances were very recognizable, the actors were extremely identifiable, and the footage blew up. It went viral. The Motion Picture Association sent cease-and-desist letters. SAG-AFTRA condemned the outputs, and Disney's legal team accused ByteDance of effectively stealing Disney's intellectual property, and ByteDance, which had planned a global rollout in mid-March, had to pull the launch. Engineers and lawyers are now scrambling to add safeguards before any international release. The pattern is instructive because it's a repeat, but at higher stakes. The text-to-image copyright disputes that defined 2023 and 2024 and defined Napster back in the day with music are now replaying in video, where the outputs involve not just visual style, but recognizable. An image that looks like it could be by a certain artist is one legal category. Video that is clearly of a specific famous person performing actions they never actually performed is a different category entirely, and it's going to be interesting trying to figure this out. So what's functioning as the governance mechanism right now? It's copyright law, cease and desist letters, trade association pressure, tools that were designed for a world where human beings had to actually create something before the rights questions arose. Studios, guilds, legal teams are using intellectual property frameworks from the 20th century to constrain capabilities those frameworks never even imagined that are suddenly on the scene here. It's worth noting what is emerging alongside this. The Calendar registry launching this week helps athletes register their biometric data, their likeness, their movement patterns, their voice, so that AI developers have a licensing framework to work with. Now that's private sector infrastructure filling the gap between what generative systems can produce and what existing law protects. And that gap filling is itself the story. When the Supreme Court declined to hear the THOR AI copyright appeal earlier this month, it left the statutory landscape exactly where it was, designed for human creators, silent on machine-generated content. So every stakeholder, studios, athletes, regulators, courts, AI developers, is now having to improvise. Each improvisation adds a piece. Copyright enforcement here, biometric registries there, cease and desist letters as a speed bump while the actual governance architecture assembles itself in real time. That's what governance becomes when the ground doesn't stop moving. This is not a stable set of rules catching up to a stable technology. This is ongoing negotiation between capacity and constraint, where neither side ever reaches equilibrium, and that is the norm now. All right, let's jump on to another story. Let's jump into the science here, because today's findings carry a pattern that deserves really its own moment and its own whole video, to be honest. Researchers at Washington University discovered that clusters of epithelial cells can sense physical features up to 100 microns away, and that is 10 times faster than a single cell can manage on its own. The mechanism: individual cells pull on what the collagen fibers around them, and they deform the matrix to feel what lies beyond, whether that's stiff tissue or bone or a tumor boundary. One cell gets 10 microns of reach, but when cells cluster, they generate collective pulling force that extends the sensing range by an order of magnitude. The cancer implications are, again, immediate, just like a new discovery every day about cancer is immediate. Tumor cells appear to exploit this collective sensing to navigate through surrounding tissue, essentially mapping their escape route through a collagen matrix before they migrate. Researchers are now working to identify the specific regulators that control sensing range, which could lead to therapies that disrupt a cancer cell's ability to see its path forward. But the deeper signal is about what becomes visible when experimental methods cross a resolution threshold. On the same day, University of New Mexico and Los Alamos National Laboratory published a framework called THOR, T-H-O-R, that solves one of the most computationally demanding problems in materials physics, the configurational integral for crystalline solids, 400 times faster than conventional simulations. A calculation that took weeks on supercomputers now takes seconds, and they did it by recognizing crystal symmetries that traditional methods couldn't exploit and encoding atomic interactions through tensor networks and machine learning. They released it open source on GitHub, which means any material science lab with standard computing resources can now perform calculations that were previously confined to national laboratory infrastructure. And at UC Santa Barbara, a physicist identified a material where two kinds of frustration, magnetic frustration and electronic bond frustration, coexist and interact for the first time. A doubly frustrated quantum material where competing states don't just sit side by side, they couple. And that coupling can potentially be controlled through an external strain. This is a new category of quantum material that didn't exist in the experimental literature until today. Now, here's what connects all these. In every case, The finding reveals coordination or structure that was always present but invisible. The epithelial cells were always pulling on collagen. The crystal symmetries were always there and waiting for a mathematical framework that could see them. The doubly frustrated quantum state was always a possibility in the right material. What changed, of course, is the resolution, as we've said so many times. Computational, experimental, mathematical, to detect what was hidden. And that resolution itself is compounding. THOR doesn't just solve one problem faster. It opens a search space for brand new materials. Battery chemistries, superconductors, catalysts that was structurally inaccessible when each calculation took weeks. Now, the epithelial sensing discovery doesn't just explain cancer migration. It reveals a coordination mechanism that might be operating across every tissue type in the body. Each finding unlocks not just an answer, but a domain of new questions that could not have been asked before. This is what happens when the instruments catch up to the complexity. The complexity was always there, but we just crossed the threshold where it becomes legible, and the threshold, once crossed, doesn't reset, it compounds. Here's what I'd like to carry out the door today. An AI system compromised thousands of network devices in 10 minutes. A different AI system manufactured 20,000 voices that may have altered a regulatory outcome affecting 2,500 lives. A third AI system generated footage of real actors so convincing it stopped a product launch. 3 institutional systems, cybersecurity, democratic governance, intellectual property law, each designed for a world where the inputs arrived at human speed. Each one, today, absorbing inputs that arrive at machine speed. And none of them breaking catastrophically, but all of them bending. So the question isn't whether they'll adapt. They will, of course. The question is what they become while adapting, because a public comment system that authenticates identity is a different institution than one that simply counts comments. A security architecture where AI defends against AI is a different domain than one where humans review alerts. And a copyright regime that licenses biometric data is a different legal framework than the one that protects original works. The institutions on either side of this transition won't be the same institutions just running faster. They will be new institutions, maybe with familiar faces, but new institutions. So very soon, watch for whether the California Attorney General opens a formal investigation into the CivicLick comments, because that decision, whether manufactured democratic participation is fraud or just aggressive advocacy, will set the template for every regulatory body in the country. And 2,500 lives are still, right now, in the balance. So let's make that a good decision. We'll see you tomorrow.